when you praise this budget and say we've done a great job, it's quite a subjective point of view, and I want to be subjective or objective on behalf of a different cohort of people than the Fine Gael TDs sitting opposite me, and that is the community and voluntary sector, the sector that looks after the people who live in poverty. And poverty is a word you very seldom hear in this House anymore. It's a word I think the government have forgotten. They talk about inclusion. Yes, inclusion's great, nice word and all the rest of it, but I'm talking about actual poverty. And poverty is a reality for many, many tens of thousands of people, and particularly children. It's also a reality for many, many tens of thousands of pensioners. And I've just come off the phone to a friend of mine who who was the CEO of the Senior Citizens Parliament, and one of the points she made to me very strongly is, first of all, on the carers allowance, because many, many senior citizens are caring for family members, some of them in their 30s, 40s and 50s with disabilities, with problems. When you're a carer and you turn 66 and you get the pension, your pension is cut in half, your carers allowance, sorry, is cut in half. What sort of treatment of that is, or recognition of that, as people who are doing a job that's absolutely needed? And it's been mentioned already many times in the House about the means testing that should have been dropped and isn't. But imagine you're caring for somebody for decades and then you come to get your old age pension, they cut your carers allowance in half a day after you turn 66. That is absolutely outrageous, and this has knocked an awful lot of older people into poverty. But I think, you know, the €12, and people are saying, yeah, great, it's at least it's not a fiver. But I think the €12 has to be put in the context of the cost of living increases, but also in the context of promises that were made to elderly people in this country. The roadmap for social inclusion 4 or 5 years ago argued, and this was a government's roadmap for social inclusion, that elderly people who've retired, need to be linked, their payment needs to be linked to 34% of the national average wage. That has never happened. That has never happened in one of the richest countries in the world, and yet it is the norm across Europe that your pension payments are linked to the average industrial wage. So instead of getting €12, if we had linked that, index linked it with the average industrial wage, pensioners today should be getting €31. It falls €19 short of what would do right by them. And we find more and more older people are falling into poverty. We find pensioners struggling to survive. Nat O'Connor, for example, from Age Action Ireland, said, "I'm relieved to see that the state pension has gone up by more than a fiver. But €12 a week increase does not replace the lost spending power since 2020. The core rate of the pension would need to be increased by a further €19 on top of the 12 to have the same spending power as 2020. Imagine that, nearly 5 years ago, they have the same spending power as then. So there's no account being taken of how the cost of living increases put pressure on the poorest people. On child poverty, we know that extreme poverty among children has risen by 27%. That 7% of children living in poverty there's a higher chance by 7% of children living in poverty for them to have a disability. And child poverty could be reduced, according to the ERSI, by 25% and would affect about 40,000 children if you had introduced a means test on top of the doubling the benefits, but a special means test for child poverty. Poverty has a negative impact on those it affects, and the younger they suffer it, the more it affects them. The longer you suffer it, the more it affects, and it affects the outcomes at the other end. And so at the other end, you have the need for addiction services, you have the need for family intervention supports, you have the need for justice services for young people who will end up in trouble with the law and going to prison, precisely because of the way they were born and reared in poverty. And I'm going to keep saying poverty in this House because nobody on that side of the House recognises that it actually exists, and it is a reality. And if you go back to when your former Minister for Finance from Limerick, what was his name? Help. But anyway, Michael Noonan. He stood there and he said, we are picking the low-hanging fruit first after the bank collapse in 2008 when he came into government, picking the low-hanging fruit for austerity. That low-hanging fruit was the drug services, the addiction services in the community, it was the family support services, it was the youth services, it was the intervention services that precisely are needed in the poorest working class and rural communities, and those cuts have never been fully restored. And Fine Gael have been in power since, and those cuts have never, ever been fully restored. So when you have your Department of Inclusion that does not look after those in addiction, that does not look after children in poverty, that takes it out on young people by discriminating against them on the dole, discriminating against them on the minimum wage, then what do you expect at the other end? Only communities that are disengaged, disaffected, alienated, and where there's a huge amount of problems because you are refusing, and it's almost like you have contempt, you're refusing to address the exclusion and the poverty that is rampant and growing. It is actually growing. While this economy grows, the rate of poverty is growing among children, among older people, and among the most vulnerable. So I want to really condemn this budget, even though we still have to see the finer details and the colour of your eye when it comes to see how much you're actually going to put into supporting addiction services, supporting youth services, supporting families that are excluded from this society. We have to see the colour of your eye on that one, but I can bet you it won't be inspiring, and you'll continue to leave people excluded and living in poverty. That's the condemnation for this government, and until you're gone and some other government comes in that will address that imbalance, we're going to see it continued. You've proven it. You've proven it for the last 11 years.
Thank you, Deputy Smith.